Hi everyone, it's my boy Sam. How are you doing today? In this second part of the tutorial series, I'll go over some of the aspects of Bootstrap, including the navigation bar, and we'll really focus on the navigation bar today. So, as we look at the current website, we have the HTML connected to both Bootstrap and a custom CSS file. What we've written so far is Microwave Sam's personal website, and we've used the Bootstrap class text center to center that, while also using a custom ID, Microwave Sam, and applying that on a style with a different coloring for a light blue coloring. So when we look at the personal website, we can see that it's just Microwave Sam's personal website, and there's nothing else besides this text-centered Microwave Sam's personal website. Now, the first thing I want to get over to you is we will get to fonts. Now, fonts are really important because they can make it or break it for your personal website. And you can use the default font, and it looks pretty fine. I mean, Bootstrap has a good font. I think it uses perhaps Open Sans in general, but maybe you want to provide your own custom font. So what do you do with that? Now, a lot of people like to use something called Google Fonts. And what Google Fonts is a collection of free fonts that Google provides for people to use. Now, if you go to google.com/fonts, you can see a collection of all the fonts available that Google provides. There are 703 font families shown. Now, you can search for several different font families, some of which are good, some of which are bad. Roboto and Open Sans are two font families that I personally like, and conveniently enough, they appear on the front page. So, to use these fonts, you can just hit this button, which is Quick Use button. And we'll use Open Sans for the purposes of this tutorial. Now, the styles means that you can have different formats for the fonts. For example, when you ever use Microsoft Word, you can always change the font to bold, italic, or normal. And that's basically what the styles here represents. You can add light, bold, and normal. And these three are really the normal three font family styles that you use. After you select your styles, you can scroll down and can add this code to your website. Now, this is very similar to the CSS connections that we wrote in the first tutorial. It provides an href to where the CSS is actually at, and then it provides the relationship of a style sheet. So all you need to do is right-click and copy this line, and then paste it inside your index.html. So I'll just conveniently paste it after style.css. And I'll Control S to save. But you're not done. So you need to integrate the font into your CSS. And to do that, use this font family : this is basically a CSS styling that uses a font family and ties the font to the contents of your website. So what we want to do over here is that you always need an identifier to tie the style CSS to. So the identifier that we will use is body. Now, body, like I said in the first tutorial, is all the contents of your web page. So if you apply this font to the body, then all the contents of your web page is tied to the body. So by doing font family : Open Sans, all the contents of our body is with the Open Sans font. Now, if we refresh the page, the font changed a little bit, and you can see that it's a little bit bigger than the default font that Bootstrap provides, but it depends on you what font you actually like. Now, I like the Open Sans font because it's a combination of readability and simplicity, and I think it looks good in general. After we've gone into font, we'll get to the core part of this tutorial, which is the navigation bar. Now, when you use Bootstrap, I'll give you some advice that the best way to use Bootstrap, for me, when you're first starting and really learning the ropes of CSS in general, is to take advantage of what's already given to you on the website and take advantage of what other different websites do, because what you learn will be based on what people have already created. And if you're an actual web designer, of course, you'll know all the tips and tricks, so you'll create your own content. But for people who aren't web designers, people who are just starting, taking what you've seen in different websites and combining all of the different websites in your personal style is really useful. And you create something that has your style, but takes from a bunch of different sources. So we'll get started. And if you scroll all the way down to this section called Examples, you'll see a bunch of Bootstrap only examples that are given. Now, they might use a little bit of custom CSS, but the core part of the websites, all of these templates, are basically Bootstrap only. So, for example, we can go to the Bootstrap theme, see how they use buttons, see how they do tables, etc., etc. But one of the good templates that Bootstrap has is that there's custom components. If you look at Carousel, I think this makes for a good personal website template. Now, looking at the contents of the web page, we see that what they use is they have the navigation bar. This is called a carousel with the slider page. Then they have sections for projects and more information. Now, what we do when we see a good template is one of two things, or two of two, or one or both of these two things. So what you can do is you can right click inspect element and look for what you want. For example, if I highlight this navigation bar, I know that this section is the navigation bar, and I'll likely copy some or most of the contents of the navigation bar to apply to our personal website. But even better, for the purposes if you're kind of gauging and copying from different websites, is right clicking and viewing the page source, which is Control U for Google Chrome. Now, when you look at the page source, you can see all the contents of the actual page. You can see the connections that they make to CSS. For this particular template, they actually have a custom CSS called carousel.css, but what we're looking for is navigation bar. So if you remember correctly, when we inspected element, we can see that it starts at nav class. So if we look at this page, the navigation bar is at nav class, and it uses it, but it's still wrapped in these two divs because I can see these two ending divs after the nav ending tag. So what we will do is we'll copy this entire section. We'll paste it into our index.html right before Microwave Sam's personal website, and always provide the spaces to really differentiate the sections. It always works better for organization in the long term because you'll add more and more content on your website, and to keep everything organized, you should just space out different sections of the web page. So once we have the navigation bar and Control S to save, if we look at our page, basically that packet or snippet of HTML uses the pre-packaged CSS from Bootstrap and creates the navigation bar for us. So one thing is, if we look at that template, we can see the drop-down bar actually does something. And in this page, it doesn't do anything. So one thing is, for troubleshooting, always important thing is the debug tools for the web console. You right-click inspect element, and you can go to console and see any debug messages. When you don't see any debug messages, usually when things don't work on your personal website, that means that something like JavaScript is wrong. Now, if you remember correctly, when we go back to Sublime, we can see that there's actually a JavaScript for Bootstrap. So bootstrap.js. So we need to make the connection for Bootstrap JavaScript file. So normally people like to put their JavaScript files before the ending body tag. So what we'll do is we'll write lesson script source equals JS, because it's in the JS folder, / for the next part of the folder, and then the file name. And we'll close it off with a greater than symbol, and then close it off with the ending script tag, and we'll Control S. Now when we refresh the page, one thing that's important to see is that there's an error. Now we see some important information, and it says that JavaScript requires jQuery. Now, doing a quick wiki on jQuery, jQuery is basically how I understand it and how I've always described it. It's kind of a framework library that provides an abbreviation to a lot of JavaScript commands. Basically, it's a really popular JavaScript library that's used by many websites and many different JavaScript libraries and JavaScript files themselves. And what it does is right here on the wiki, it says it's easier to navigate a document. And it creates animations, handle events, and it really abbreviates JavaScript to make it more readable and understandable. So we need to get jQuery. Now, how do we get jQuery? Well, we know that the dropdown works for this template. and we take resources from whatever sites that we see. So if we look at the end of this, the page source of the website, we can see they actually reference a link to the jQuery library. Now this is useful to us because it's also a link, so we don't need it locally. So we can just copy and paste this line, and it will work for us. Now for the placement, we always want to place whatever requirements at the top. So for example, what I mean by that is Bootstrap requires jQuery, so we want to make sure that jQuery loads before Bootstrap, so we'll put the jQuery line before Bootstrap. And we'll Control S to save, and we'll refresh the page, and we look at dropdown, the dropdown menu works now. Now we'll see that the website currently has a bunch of filter names, and we want to change that. So what we want to do is first, we'll change, for example, project name to Microwave Sam. We'll keep home and about because that's generally what you have on a personal website. But for contact, we'll write something like portfolio because we want to really show off what we've done. And portfolio is a good start. And for this section, we also want to write portfolio. For the dropdown, we'll write social media. And if you're a big social media person, then you can write things like Twitter. For example, I can write my YouTube channel. And then, for this part, I'll write, let's see, what else do I have? LinkedIn. Now, let's get to some other parts of the website that you might not understand yet if you don't have too much experience with HTML or CSS. So first of all, there's a lot of content of this web page, and a lot of it you don't need to know what it does. But for the things that you do, so one thing that I didn't explain in tutorial part 1 is this A tag. Now, what does A tag do? It stands for anchor tag, and what it does is it can provide connections to different links to different websites or the current website. And when you do href, href always stands for any connection, right? So href equals this pound symbol. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we go back to the page and let's just refresh to, well, I didn't save yet, so I'll save this and refresh again. It says Microwave Sam now. Now, you might see this pound symbol that was added to the end of the web page, and basically what happens is that if you hit any href button that references to this pound symbol, then it basically just reloads the page. That's all you need to know about that. Now for the rest of the content, for example, there are also href on these links, and now we probably want to provide an actual link to Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So what we'll do is at this href section, we'll just put the link itself. So for example, I'll put my Twitter account, I'll put my YouTube channel, and I'll put my LinkedIn. And you can do the same thing. So after putting the 3 of those links, you can delete this bottom part. What this bottom part basically is if you look at the social media part of our webpage, and we see this separator, and then we see nav header, separated link, one more separated link, then you can see that that's basically what that portion in the HTML does. But we don't really need that because I don't have that many social media links, so I'll just delete that content. And afterwards, I'll just delete the spacing and then Control S to save. And when we refresh the page, if I hit the YouTube link, then it redirects me to the YouTube channel. And that's all that href does. Now, how can we make this website look a little bit better? So we see Microwave Sam, home, about, portfolio, social media. So one thing is that a lot of people don't like to put their brand as just a word, right? They like to put pictures, your logo, and whatnot. So what I've done is, if we look at our desktop, and if we go to the folder where we actually put all of our contents of our personal website, what I've put in is an image. And in this image folder, I put in a brand-pic.jpg. So if we look at what that photo is, it's just my Microwave Sam logo. So we want to put that logo at this section of the page. And how do we do that? So when you're adding new content, sometimes you don't know if this new content will look better than the old content. So what I like to do is add a comment to the old content, which basically erases the content from being seen on the HTML, but keeps it on the actual HTML file. So this is how you do comments in HTML. So basically, you do this less than, exclamation point, 2 hyphens, and then as the ending comment tag, you do 2 hyphens and a greater than symbol. And what happens is if I Control S right now, it deletes that section, but still, you can always reference it back in HTML. So we're going to add an image, and how do you add images? So you do the less than symbol, then you do image, then you do source, and then connect it to wherever the image is at. So it's similar to the JavaScript connection command. So basically, we'll do image, and we'll type in brandpic.jpg, and then as for images, all you need to do is do the backslash, or slash I mean, and then greater than symbol. So after doing that, and we see that's all I did, we'll do Control S to save, refresh the page, and we see that the image is huge, but it's right where we want it to be, at the left side where our logo should be. Now to change height and width in HTML and CSS, what you can do is you can add an ID to this image. Now, when we add an ID, then it makes it easier to add custom CSS to that particular ID. So we can separate the styling into 2 files. Why we do this is, of course, you can always add inline styling to HTML. And what I mean by inline styling is that you can actually put styling like this into your HTML. And it works, but it gets really confusing because if you're making a really big website, you add a lot of styling, and you don't want all the styling inside your HTML. But to demonstrate that this works, and whenever you want to create quick changes, you can do this, but I don't recommend it. So what I do is I set the style equals height : 20 pixels. And if we refresh the page, the styling, of course, changes. But we don't want to do this because we want to isolate our styling in our HTML. So I'll just Control X this part and then erase this. And what I'll do is I'll add an ID. And like I said before, IDs are just identifiers that can be used to provide the connections between the HTML and CSS. So we'll do brand-pic. We'll go back to our style.css. We'll use the pound symbol because pound symbol represents the connections to IDs. We'll do brand-pic, the curly brace, and then we'll paste this line of styling. And we'll erase the quotes because CSS doesn't use quotes, and we'll put the semicolon. Now for the height and width, we saw that the height wasn't big enough, so we'll do 40 pixels. And pixels is just a measurement for images. Now that size looks good enough to me, but I don't like the spacing over here. It's not far enough down. So to change that, it's something called margin. And when we talk about margin, there are 2 things for spacing things out: left, right, up, or down. And there are 2 key words that a lot of people who use CSS are familiar with. It's called padding and margin. And what padding does is padding is the spacing in between different elements, and what margin is spacing on the outside of the element. And it's kind of hard to describe. I kind of go into more detail in my tutorials I did a year ago called like Introduction to HTML CSS or something like that. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I won't really go into the differences between padding and margin. You can play it out a little bit and see the differences, but there are some differences when you use it with combined elements. So if you do padding, the spacing in between gets kind of messed up because what you do with padding is you basically enlarge the element. So you enlarge the element by this how many pixels. But with margin, you do spacing on the outside of the element. So you don't enlarge that specific element, but you do spacing on the outside for margin. So hopefully I explained that well enough. So what we want to do is we want to do something called margin top. And we want to add spacing from the top side and move that element a little bit down. So how many pixels will move it down? I think 5 pixels will be good enough. But let's just refresh and see if 5 pixels will be good enough. It looks pretty good to me. So that spacing is pretty good. But what we have a problem with now is that this home is way too close to that logo. So what we'll do is we'll use something called pull right. And that's a command that I remember, a class I remember. But sometimes when you're using Bootstrap, what's really useful is you look at some of the templates that Bootstrap provides. And something that I like is, hey, look at this back to the top. It's conveniently on the right side. How do they do this? Well, you can always right-click and inspect elements. This is something I recommended strongly in the first part of the tutorial. You right-click, inspect element, you see what it is. It's in an ahref, but the P class that surrounds the ahref says the class is pull-right. And if we deleted this, let's just delete this, and we enter. Back to top goes to the left, so we know that this moves everything to the right. Now, to apply this to our personal website, we look at the section that we really want to change, and we want to add to the right side. So right over here, I think this is a good section where we want to add, because we want to move home and all of its contents to the right side. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, we look at the UL, and I think at this UL section would be a good place to start. So we just apply it within the class. So you can apply multiple classes to every section of the page. So what I do is I just add this pull-right to the class. So I Control S to save. I go to my website, and I see that the website is looking pretty good. Everything's to the right, and everything's even. Looks good. Home, about, portfolio, and social media goes to the links. Now, what we see over here is it looks a little bit different. First of all, there's a rounded edge, and it's spaced a little bit down. Now, how do they do this? Because ours doesn't look like that. Well, how they do this, if we look at the source code, is that they have a custom CSS. Now, if we click on this, we can see all the contents of their custom.css, and we can see what they do. Now, we'll see their section for the navbar wrapper. And we see that they do position absolute. They do z-index to keep this navbar. Z-index means that this has priority and will appear on top of all the other elements that are greater or less than the z-index. So, for example, if I had a paragraph tag with a 10 z-index, then this navbar wrapper would appear above it. And they apply some different things to customize the navbar. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details because, of course, there's some things with padding, there's some things with width. And what we can do is, if you really like it, then you can copy it. And that's really how you do web development when you're first starting. You copy from different websites that you find that it looks pretty good, and you just use it on your personal website. And this is how you learn quickly, because you learn by doing, and the only way you learn by doing is either you can read long lines of documentation, but the purposes for a YouTube tutorial is really to get you started very quickly. And that's how you get started quickly. You just learn by copying whatever looks good. And that looks pretty good to me, so I'll copy it to my style.css. I'll put it where all my navigation is, so I'll put it after the body, but before the brain pick. And these comments, these are CSS comments, and how CSS comments are used is that they use backslash and then a star, and then for the ending tag, they use star backslash. And now, if we Control S to save, what the CSS basically does is it overwrites some of the features. This is a Bootstrap class, and it overwrites that Bootstrap class with some custom CSS. So it changes the Bootstrap class a little bit so that it fits correctly on the page. So we refresh this page. Well, what got fixed is that this social media that was kind of cut off before is now in a convenient, good place. But it didn't move down, so we know that some other CSS was added to fix that. So let's see what was actually added. So we look around the page, and we see that media min width is used for responsive CSS. So what this at media does is that if the minimum width, or if the current width is 768 pixels, then it applies a different CSS to it. So what we'll do is, let's see, we'll copy this section, and we'll copy the responsive CSS, and we'll apply it after our brand pick, because this is where the responsive CSS section should be. Now, we haven't gotten into carousel or feature a heading, so we'll delete these two sections. But as for the navbar, to get it the navbar responsive, because Bootstrap, one of the key features of it that I didn't really go into is, first we'll refresh this page, and now it's brought down because the minimum width, I was mistaken when I explained minimum width. If the minimum width is this side, then this is the CSS that will be applied to that minimum width. So since my computer has a width of like 1,200, or it's a very odd width. I have one of those laptops that have a really odd width. Then this CSS is applied, and so now the navigation bar is like that. And since we don't really need this personal website content, we'll just delete it to get this thing out of the way, because we don't want that over there. And what we'll do with the style.css is that we had this microwave Sam ID, and we can delete it because we're not using it anymore. So after that, and we refresh the page, we can see that what have we added. So what this custom CSS did was it added a border radius, and what border radius does is it rounds out the navigation bar. So by applying this border radius, the navigation bar gets rounded by the 4 pixels, and it looks much nicer. And so margin dash top basically moves it down like we did with the logo. And so now it's positioned pretty nicely, and additionally, it's rounded. So right now, I really like how it looks like. We have our social media pages, our about portfolio, and the navigation bar is basically done. What can we do to improve it? Well, off the top of my head, I think this is a good stop for the tutorial, and we've really shown how to use some of the aspects of Bootstrap, how to take advantage of different websites, and how to combine all the features of different websites and create our own style and our own information for our personal website. So this is a good start, and for the second tutorial, I'll get to explaining how to do this slider page, which is useful for your purposes and will be pretty cool to have. So thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned for the third tutorial of the series, and please rate, comment, subscribe.